All right, and it is 6 o'clock. So with that, why don't we get started? Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be starting a mock lecture with our presenter, Dr. Karen Woodall, who is a forensic toxicologist. And I know on the program, the title said cannabis and coping, and it will kind of be about that. We're just going to be going into a few other drugs as well for your viewing pleasure. It's going to be we're going to have some time to do the mock lecture, and then you guys can open the floor to some Q&A questions afterwards as well. So think of any questions you'd like to ask while Dr. Woodall is presenting. We also have with us Esme Newling, who is our student representative and outreach assistant for the forensic science program, and Tara Colarusso, who is with the admissions team. So lots of people here who can field your questions if you should have them. But with that, I will throw it over to Dr. Woodall, who's going to take it away.
Hey, hi everyone. So yeah, maybe the title's slightly different to what you expected, but cannabis is one of the hot topics in forensic toxicology, but also opioids is a hot topic. I couldn't pick one of them, so I decided I would talk about both. So yeah, if you don't, hopefully you might recognize these plants. The top one is the cannabis plant. I think that's easily recognizable. And the bottom one is the opium poppy. So in terms of cannabis, it's interesting. There's lots of strong opinions about cannabis. Some people think it's the worst drug ever, is kind of the evil weed. It just causes harm to anybody that would take it. And then you've also got the flip side of that, which is now some people think that cannabis is the best thing ever, that it cures any kind of disease or problem anybody ever has. For example, you see this headline, it's official, cannabis cures cancer. Obviously, as with most things, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I'm a forensic toxicologist, so I'm always aware of the kind of the harm and the toxic side of things, but I also know the benefits that drugs can give as well. So cannabis, definitely, even though the drug's been around for thousands of years, the research and the science is really evolving, and lots more research is being done in current years. So what is cannabis? I'm sure you kind of have your own ideas about what cannabis is. But just in general, it's the name for any product that comes from the cannabis plant. And cannabis plant, it's used for its psychoactive properties. Really, that means it can change the way your brain functions. You can take it because you want to kind of get a sense of euphoria. You want to feel kind of relaxed, and also therapeutic effects. So there is a lot of research that shows there are a lot of things that cannabis is actually good for. So cannabis contains hundreds of chemical substances. The ones that are important for scientists are ones that are called the cannabinoids. And there's hundreds of them. Two important ones that I'm interested in are tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, and then cannabidiol, or CBD. THC is the psychoactive compound, so that's one of the main reasons why traditionally people took cannabis. And CBD is the one that in more recent years, people are focusing a lot on, and it has a lot of medicinal qualities to it. In terms of how does it act on the body, there's actually a whole receptor system in the body called the endocannabinoid system that 10, 20 years ago, people had never really heard of, but these are the actual, there's actual natural receptors in the body that the cannabis chemicals bind to that creates all sorts of effects. The CB1 receptors are found predominantly in the central nervous system, and the CB2 receptor is found in other parts of the body, so the immune system, for example. And it's so well spread out around the body. That's one of the reasons why there is so much research and so many things that now people say that cannabis might be useful for. Common ways to consume cannabis. I think smoking has always been kind of one of the most traditional ways, the marijuana cigarette. In recent years, vaping has become a very popular way of consuming cannabis. And then also in recent years, edibles. Edibles I find quite interesting. As a toxicologist, you see a lot of problems with people that overdose on edibles. If you smoke cannabis, you can kind of control the dose quite easily. So you know how high you're getting from it. Whereas edibles, because of the pharmacology of the drug, if you take an edible, you're not going to start to feel the effects maybe for an hour, maybe even longer. So you get these issues where people will take like a gummy containing THC. They think it's not working. So then they take another one and then maybe another one. And then an hour later, when the effects start to come in, it's already too late then, and they're feeling some pretty kind of nasty side effects from having too much cannabis. And you see that a lot in regular consumers that are used to smoking cannabis because they feel like they know the product and can take a lot. But edibles, you do have to be careful. Other things that I'm interested in, and I've seen this myself, I've been working as a forensic toxicologist for over 20 years now. The potency or the strength of cannabis has changed a lot. So back in the 60s and 70s, your average THC concentration in a marijuana cigarette, and remember THC is the active ingredient. So the more THC, the more it's going to give you the effects, the reason why you're going to be smoking a marijuana cigarette. So it was 1 to 3% maximum. In the 1980s, 1990s, the average concentration had increased to about 6%. And then by the 2000s, the average concentration had gone up to about 17% THC. So a huge difference. You can see this too if you go onto the Ontario Cannabis Store. Obviously, if you're old enough to legally buy cannabis. Nowadays, products that are less than 7% are classed as very, very mild. And even just under 17% is only classed as a medium dose. Now, like the strong or very strong doses can even be higher than 20% THC. So very, very different from the cannabis people used to smoke in the 60s and the 70s, for example. And that can have effects on people. If you're taking a much stronger product, you might feel a lot more effects from taking it. Some common ways, I already mentioned the marijuana cigarette, which is one of the most traditional. That comes from the dried flowers and leaves of the cannabis plant. If you wanted a stronger product, people have ways of extracting the THC, and it will give you this very, very concentrated hash oil product, or you can make other products. For example, shatter is one that contain like over 80% concentration of THC. And often people use some of these products in vape pens. These are the ones you have to be really, really careful about because the concentration is very, very high. And then cannabutter, which is a butter that's infused with cannabis. Obviously, people can use that to bake their own edibles, but this is becoming a very kind of common formulation of the drug. In terms of cannabis, a lot of people use it for medical, recreational purposes, but a lot of it's to do with kind of mental health. So people want to feel more relaxed if they're feeling stressed or anxious. Cannabis is a way that a lot of people say, well, that's one of the major reasons why I use it. And in fact, the sales of cannabis products since the pandemic hit has really increased, which kind of buys into that of people taking it because they're really stressed out because of what's going on. So cannabis and anxiety is something, there is science behind it. So if you take a cannabis product, would it help you with your anxiety? And people who report that they use it, a lot of people use it for social anxiety disorders. So that's something that, you know, if you're one of those people that you might get anxious if you're going out to a social situation, like maybe a part, well, I guess we don't really go out to parties that much anymore because of the pandemic, but you get the idea. It's those situations, or maybe if you're giving a presentation and you get very, very nervous, people sometimes will use cannabis to try and reduce their anxiety. The interesting thing is with cannabis is if you're taking a THC product, it can help decrease your anxiety at lower doses, but it actually does the opposite at higher doses. It can actually increase your anxiety. So like any other drug, you really do have to be careful about what you're taking. Sorry, these slides keep moving. Anyway, so you do have to be careful what you're taking. And this is where the interesting thing comes in with CBD. So CBD actually does the same as THC at low concentrations, which can decrease a person's anxiety. But even if you take high concentrations of CBD, it doesn't appear to produce anxiety. So it doesn't have an anxiogenic effect. So sometimes people, if they're getting a cannabis product, if they choose one that has a higher CBD concentration and maybe a lower THC, that actually might be better for their mental health. Another thing that people talk about is the link between cannabis and schizophrenia, or not maybe schizophrenia, but cannabis-induced psychosis. People have discussed this for many years about is there a link with cannabis use and psychosis? There's a lot of anecdotal reports that show people that use cannabis a lot can develop schizophrenia or end up with some kind of temporary psychosis. But some people said, yeah, well, these are anecdotal reports. There's not really kind of any science behind it. So even though you might get doctors working in kind of the mental health field that will say, no, I see more and more patients, they've developed schizophrenia after smoking cannabis. Other people have said, well, what's the scientific proof? There are starting to become studies though now. This one was published 2019 and looked at the kind of the use of cannabis in people in Europe, and then did some in-depth analysis to see if it did increase your risk in developing schizophrenia. And it found that some of the strongest independent predictors of whether somebody would have a psychotic disorder were daily use of cannabis and also the use of high potency cannabis. So if you recall now, cannabis, you can get very strong cannabis. It's stronger than it was even 10 years ago. And that's something that people need to be aware of, especially if you're buying it from an illicit source, because you don't always know the strength of the cannabis. And people that use it on a daily basis were also more likely to develop symptoms of schizophrenia. So in terms of the factors that it's important, so the increasing strength of cannabis is thought to play a risk. But interestingly, some studies have showed that the ratio of THC to CBD may also be important. So a little bit like the anxiety that I was just talking about, where CBD can actually play a protective role. So again, if people want to take a cannabis product but are worried about some of the harmful effects, having a cannabis product with increasing CBD concentrations and maybe lower THC could be something that people should consider. So THC versus CBD, again, there's been a few scientific studies now that have been published showing that THC may induce acute psychotic effects, whereas CBD may actually have antipsychotic properties. And now people are actually starting to look to see whether a CBD product without THC could actually be helpful in the treatment of schizophrenia. So it's interesting, these two chemicals from the same plant can have very different properties. Okay, so as a forensic toxicologist, I have to talk about cannabis and driving, because it's well known that THC can impair your ability to drive. And a few years ago in Canada, when cannabis was set to be legalized, it was one of the things that worried kind of the government, it worried forensic toxicology laboratories, it worried police forces, because the thought was we're going to see an increase in cannabis impaired driving. What are we going to do about it? So one of the things that the government of Canada did was they introduced some new laws to get ready for the issue of cannabis impaired driving. Some of those highlights were the introduction of blood drug offences, and that means that you're setting a limit where it's illegal to drive above a limit. So alcohol, you probably heard things like 0.08 or 80 milligrams in 100 millilitres of blood. That's the limit where it's illegal to drive if you've got that much alcohol in your system. They introduced a similar thing for the THC. The other thing that the government did was that they authorized the use of roadside drug screening equipment, again, for the detection of things like THC. This would be equivalent to the breath testing instruments that you might have seen used if people are suspected to have been drinking and driving, but they're slightly different and they're designed for drug detection. Just in terms of the laws, the blood level, there's different penalties, but essentially anything above 2 nanograms per mil of THC in your blood, it's illegal to drive with that much in your system. And there's higher penalties if you have a higher concentration of 5 nanograms per mil of THC in your system. And there's also strict penalties if you're drinking alcohol with THC in your system. And the science behind that is the more THC you have in your system, the more likely it's going to be impairing. And there's a lot of science also that shows that alcohol and cannabis combined increases impairing effects. So that's why you've got these 3 different charges in the Criminal Code of Canada now. So in addition to the blood drug offences, there's the roadside testing. And they do that by looking at drugs in oral fluid. And drugs can be detected in oral fluid, partly because they get excreted from the blood. So oral fluid, it's more the scientific name for saliva, really. But also if you recently maybe smoked cannabis, you're going to have cannabis or THC in your oral cavity, so in your mouth. And so it can be picked up on these oral fluid drug screeners. Some advantages of this are that an oral fluid sample is relatively easy to collect. It has minimal health risks. And when I say minimal health risks, that's comparing it to maybe taking a blood sample. And obviously a blood sample, blood tends to be easier to catch various diseases from direct contact with blood. And then you've got the health risks of somebody having a needle trying to take blood. So that's what I mean by minimal health risks. And no privacy issues, because another sample that police sometimes can take for detecting drugs is a urine sample. But obviously a urine sample, you need to have kind of privacy, you need to have a washroom available. So there's different issues, but being able to put a swab in somebody's mouth and just to collect a sample of saliva, it's probably one of the most simple ways of seeing if somebody's under the influence of a drug. In some ways, though, you might think, well, this is easy. You've got these instruments now, these ways of detecting drugs at the roadside. This is going to be great for law enforcement. It's going to be great for people trying to stop or reduce impaired driving. But there was a lot of media coverage when some of these instruments got approved. One, for example, the Draeger drug test 5000. It's not supposed to be used in extreme temperatures. So you imagine all the headlines about, well, how can you have a drug in Canada if it can't be used when it's -20 out? The reality is, though, you can't keep these things out in cold temperatures for long periods of time, but for a short period of time while you just collect, like testing a sample briefly, they do work quite well in that situation. And they've been used in other countries that have similar climates to Canada. So Scandinavian countries, for example, use this type of equipment and have had no problem using it in extreme weather. But when you get media coverage, it kind of creates all these issues, and then people start to lose confidence in them. Another example is a roadside drug testing device that picked up false positives from somebody eating a poppy seed loaf from Tim Hortons, or people drinking tea, that kind of thing. So some defense lawyers bought their own instruments and they did their own tests, and then they published this in kind of the media saying, look, they don't work. So there's a lot of legal challenges saying, how can you have these devices if they actually make you think somebody's under the influence of cannabis when they're not really? So one of the question comes from, we want to manage to kind of investigate drug impaired driving, but we want to be able to do it accurately. You don't want to arrest people, charge people if they haven't actually been driving whilst under the influence of a drug. But oral fluid drug testing has actually been well established in the field of forensic toxicology. It's been used for many years in many different countries. It's widely used in Europe, for example, Australia, the United States. It's just in Canada, it's relatively new to Canada. And so I was at a conference last year, and one of the things mentioned at the conference was to increase the confidence of law enforcement and the court system in Canada about the use of these oral fluid drug testing. We need to increase education, and also we need to do our own research to make sure that they do work properly. So this slide is a slide that I actually used when I presented at a conference last September. And it was one of the things I was talking about, the future research that needs to be done for this oral fluid drug testing equipment. And because of the reports in the media, number one on the list that I put up was the incidence of false positives. It was, well, okay, are there things people could be using, eating whilst out driving that would cause a false positive result? I thought that's important. People need to know that. The use in cold climates. Can we take these out kind of in real bad weather situations in Canada and see if they still work? And then another one was just to see if, well, if you test positive on oral fluid, does it mean you're above the drug concentration where it's illegal to drive with? So what's nice when you have all these future research ideas is when you can work with students and actually get some of that research done. So from future research, it then turns into current research. So I was lucky enough to have one of the fourth year forensic science students last year work with me on a research project. So we had the Draeger drug test 5000, and my student, Adrienne, she did work using to see if false positives, or there were false positives on the Draeger drug test 5000. So she got volunteers to consume things like poppy seed loaf from Tim Hortons. She got them to chew gum and then provide a sample. And in all of the volunteers that she did, there wasn't a single false positive produced, which is what we were expecting and what we were hoping. But it's still very important to kind of do the research, because then it's the first time that the instruments that are actually designed to be used in Canada has actually had kind of a well-designed scientific study done with it to show that in these circumstances, you don't get false positive results. And so it was nice that Adrienne's research was completed during her fourth year at the university. Okay, so the second part of my presentation, I want to talk about opioids, and specifically the opioid crisis. It's something I'm sure that you will have heard about because it's been big news for a few years now. And essentially, it's a huge issue kind of around the world and definitely in Canada. And it's one of the sort of biggest issues in the field of forensic toxicology today. So, but what are opioids? Well, opioids are drugs that they can come from natural source. So a lot of them arise from the opium poppy. So morphine, for example, comes from the opium poppy. And there's also synthetic opioids. And they're used as very effective pain medications, but also they can be very addictive, and people can get extreme kind of high from taking opioids, which is one of the reasons why it's created all these issues and the current opioid crisis. When I say the opioid crisis, what do I mean? Well, a lot of it is the number of people that are dying from opioid overdoses. This graph shows the number of opioids in deaths in the province of Ontario. And you can see that really since maybe about 2015, especially if you look at the blue line, fentanyl, the number of fentanyl deaths that occur just in our province every year is well over 1,000 now. And it shows no sign of slowing down. It's still increasing. Back in the early 2000s, we would get maybe 1 or 2 fentanyl deaths a year in this province. Then around 2006, 2007, it started to increase, and we would get maybe around 50 fentanyl deaths a year. And that's when I became interested specifically in fentanyl and deaths occurring after fentanyl use. And then now it's just unfortunately kind of exploded. There's so many the deaths that occur every year. It's not just Ontario. These stats come from the Public Health Agency of Canada. And you can see that even just this year, January, February, March, in Canada, there's been over 1,000 deaths that have occurred due to opioid overdoses. There's also many hospitalizations and emergency medical services required. And the number of opioid deaths during the current COVID crisis has also significantly increased. So this isn't a problem that's going away. In fact, this is a problem that's getting worse all the time. So in terms of opioids, kind of how strong are they and kind of why are they a problem? And specifically, why are drugs like fentanyl such a problem? So different opioids have different strengths. So for example, one of the mildest opioids is codeine, and it's often prescribed after minor dental work. And you can even get it at a pharmacy store if you ask the pharmacist for it, because it is a mild drug. Fentanyl, on the other hand, if that's prescribed to you, it's only prescribed for chronic pain conditions in patients that are already tolerant to opioids. And that's because it's such a strong drug. And you get charts that show the strength or potency of opioids that are used by medical personnel. And they do that because they want to avoid potentially fatal dosing errors. This chart is one of the charts that physicians would use. Everything is based from morphine. So morphine is like assigned the score of 1. And codeine, for example, because it's mild, it's like a 10th as strong as morphine, whereas oxycodone is just slightly stronger than morphine. Heroin is 5 times stronger than morphine. The reason why heroin is on this list is because there are some countries, so some in Europe, for example, where heroin is still a prescription opioid that people use if they're in extreme pain conditions. But fentanyl, you can see fentanyl is actually up to 100 times stronger than morphine. And morphine itself is a very strong opioid. So you've got this drug that is really, really strong. And so fentanyl became available kind of in the 2000s as a pain patch. So it's a bit like the say nicotine patches that people wear to stop smoking, except it's a pain patch. So you can put it on your skin and wear it for up to 3 days, because fentanyl is unique in terms of opioids that it can actually be absorbed through the skin. So you've got this strong opioid that you can wear if you've got chronic pain. You also can be given it in hospital as injectable liquids. Illicit fentanyl, or like illegal fentanyl, is usually in powder form, and it's sold on the streets. Sometimes people will sell it as heroin, which again causes problems because people don't realize that it's actually a much stronger drug. There's also drugs related to fentanyl, and there's counterfeit pharmaceuticals. These can be particularly dangerous because people make tablets, like oxycodone tablets, but they make them with fentanyl. So it's much stronger. And you actually get, you can get hot spots of fentanyl in the tablet. So you hear horrible or really sad stories where people will just cut up and take half a tablet and it's got concentrated fentanyl in it, and they will die from a fentanyl overdose, and they don't realize that they're about to take such a strong drug. The pain patches is one of the first ways that it was seen that people did start to abuse fentanyl on the streets. The fentanyl patch, there's two types. There's a drug reservoir patch, and this one, it actually has the fentanyl or the drug kind of dissolved in a gel, like inside the patch, and then you put it on your skin and it gradually dissolves in the skin. The trouble with this type of patch is that people that wanted to get high discovered it was very easy, for example, to get a needle, insert it into the patch, pull out the gel and inject it. So it was a great way for them to get high, but that's when the number of deaths started to increase because people were overdosing. With the patch too, you could chew the patch. That's also a way of using it. You could smoke the patch. Once people realized that there was deaths were increasing and these were easily abused, the manufacturers changed to a different type of patch known as a matrix patch. And it didn't have the gel reservoir in the middle. It was suspended in a solid matrix. So it was harder to inject the contents of the patch, but people could still cut it up and chew the patch. They could still smoke the patch. So unfortunately, it didn't really do anything to decrease the number of deaths that were occurring due to fentanyl overdoses. Okay, so if I'm giving presentations about fentanyl, I like to talk about kind of the addictive nature of fentanyl, and I'll always explain, like, I'm not an addiction specialist, but I have kind of an anecdote just to explain how addictive it is. Just as for a warning, it's pretty gross. So if anybody doesn't want to hear a gross story, feel free to mute me until you see this slide disappear, and then it's safe to unmute yourself. Okay, so there's been a lot of cases where people will die and they have a fentanyl patch like still on their body because they're wearing the skin patch. And then in places where people work in death investigations, so maybe in an autopsy or sometimes at funeral homes, people have actually taken the fentanyl patch off the deceased individual, and then they've chewed the patch to get high because they're so addictive to fentanyl. And so for me, these types of stories just show a drug is really, really addictive when you're willing to remove a patch from like a dead body and chew it to get high. So that's just my kind of story to explain how addictive fentanyl is. Other sad cases that forensic toxicologists often get involved in, obviously the drug overdoses are extremely sad when, even when people kind of are addicted to drugs, they're abusing drugs, but you also get cases where people are exposed to fentanyl accidentally, and because it's such a powerful drug, deaths can occur even after accidental exposure. So this headline, for example, shows like it was in Winnipeg, but parents were arrested after a baby boy suffers a possible fentanyl overdose. And unfortunately, this is just one headline, but this happens occasionally. People are using drugs in a home where there's a young child. They get their hands on it for many different reasons. So you get these overdoses. So it's not even just people that are using the drug and knowingly using the drug, it's people just exposed to it. For any dog lovers out there, it's also can be an issue for dogs. So for example, there's been headlines about puppies and other dogs that have overdosed because they've managed to, maybe somebody's thrown a fentanyl patch into the garbage, the dog's got into it and chewed on it, or they're in a home where somebody's got powdered fentanyl around, and again, maybe they lick something with the powdered fentanyl on. And so even dogs are overdosing from fentanyl. The last thing I'm going to talk about is related to fentanyl, and it's a drug called carfentanil. So chemically, it's very, very similar to fentanyl, but unlike fentanyl that is actually still widely used, like in hospital settings, it's prescribed, it can be a very, very useful opioid. Carfentanil has never been approved for use in humans. It's approved for use in large animals. And when I say large animals, I'm talking really large. So for example, it's used as an elephant tranquilizer. And one of the reasons why it's never been approved for use in humans is because it is so strong. So it's 100 times stronger than fentanyl or 10,000 times stronger than morphine. It's been used as a chemical warfare agent. So for example, years ago in Moscow, there was a theater siege and lots of people died, and two drugs, one of them being carfentanil, was kind of pumped into the theater, and people died due to the exposure to the drug. So it's been used as a chemical warfare agent. And then in the last few years in Canada, it started to be seen sold on the streets. So first of all, it was sold kind of mixed in with heroin and fentanyl, and people really didn't know what it was. They didn't know how strong it was. And the number of carfentanil deaths have started to really increase, especially if people don't know what they're taking, because as you can see here, it's 10,000 times stronger than morphine, which is already a strong opioid anyway. So again, the opioid crisis is something that it's still causing a lot of deaths, and then even more potent or powerful drugs are starting to be discovered and being used. From a forensic toxicology point of view, it means you have to keep up to date with methods to detect these drugs. You need to do more research on, like, how are they toxic? What's a toxic concentration? Because carfentanil, it's because it's not been approved for use in humans, there's not been a lot of controlled research done on it in humans because it's too dangerous to use in humans. So a lot of research done in forensic toxicology is looking at things like deaths that have occurred due to carfentanil use. So yeah, the two kind of main kind of issues right now, or the two issues for forensic toxicology laboratories or people interested in research in forensic toxicology, are things like the opioids and the fentanyls and the carfentanils, methods of detection, like deaths that are occurring after use. And then one of the other big areas, as earlier in the lecture, is cannabis, the general effects of cannabis, and also cannabis impaired driving. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, anything from the lecture or anything about the forensic science program at UTM.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to go into the chats on FeedLoop to look for questions now. We actually do have one for you right off the bat. So Fong says, I've heard that marijuana can be prescribed as painkillers as well. I'm not sure if this means that it can be as addictive as the drugs that you've mentioned. Did you want to comment or weigh in on that?
Yes, so yes, there's cannabis products can definitely be prescribed. And in fact, for many years, even before it was legalized, it was often given for medical reasons, and people with cancer, for example, chronic pain conditions were prescribed it. It's not as addictive as drugs such as opioids. There is, with any drug, well, not any drug, but drugs such as cannabis, there is some people that can get addicted, but actually it's less addictive than alcohol, for example, definitely less addictive than drugs such as opioids. And even with drugs that can be addictive, if you're getting it prescribed from a physician and they can control the dose and you're under medical supervision, you have less to worry about because you're taking it kind of as prescribed.
Great, thank you. And we also have, so this was more of a comment than a question, but maybe you can expand on it. Yasmin said there should be more regulations and procedures or precautions. So why do you think there aren't more regulations when it comes to doctors prescribing things like fentanyl?
So it's funny that's a good question. And there's more regulations that are actually occurring all the time. So when death started to increase, people started to look at some of the regulations, and now people are like doctors, there's very strict rules for prescribing opioids such as fentanyl, and they now share information. So there's something called double doctoring, where people would go to one doctor, get a prescription maybe for an opioid, then they'd go to a totally different doctor and ask for the same prescription, and there wasn't any information that showed this person was actually getting double the amount. Now they've got all these systems in place so they can see who's prescribing what. If a doctor is prescribing too many opioids for one individual or too many individuals, they can get flagged and get investigated. They've even got ways of reducing issues. So for example, when you prescribe these fentanyl pain patches, you have to take the pain patches back to the used ones back to the pharmacist before you can get your next prescription, because there was an issue with people selling their own prescription medications kind of on the street. So you can't get your next prescription unless you can prove that the prescription you had has all been used and you're returning like the empty packages to the pharmacist. So there's definitely more regulations kind of added all the time. One of the issues though with the opioid crisis is that a lot of the fentanyl now that's on the streets that's being abused is illicit fentanyl. So it's drug dealers that are importing the chemicals to make it, and it's all being made on the street.
Okay. So another question we have is it possible to overdose on marijuana? When it was first legalized in California, this person heard that it's impossible to unless you use a large amount in a very short amount of time.
So there's no reported deaths that have ever occurred from an overdose of marijuana. So in that sense, you could say that it's quite a safe drug in terms of you don't necessarily have to worry about overdose and dying like you do with the opioids. If edibles are the thing that has caused the most problem, and I mentioned this earlier in the talk, it's hard to control your dose with edibles. So people that smoke marijuana, it's something that people call self-titration. So as you're smoking marijuana, it gets absorbed into your body as you're smoking. So you're aware of how high you're getting. And if you are starting to get too much of an effect, then you can stop smoking immediately and you self-titrate yourself. With edibles, it's too late because by the time you've eaten them, it's like an hour later before the effects kick in. And so people can have enough effects that they end up going to the hospital, like the emergency room. They can suffer from kind of psychotic symptoms. Their heart rate can be going. They can feel extremely nauseous, like very kind of extreme effects from having too many edibles. So I'd say edibles are the thing to worry about in terms of overdosing.
Okay. Yasmin asks, why wasn't cannabis made legal only for medicinal purposes and not for any other, or only for medicinal purposes and for any other mandatory purposes?
It's interesting. So I'm just going to put my forensic hat on and say, if I was asked that question when I was testifying in a trial, I would say, that's not within my area of expertise as a forensic toxicologist, because I don't make the laws. I can just tell you about the science. So but I can tell you that there's a lot of laws get made with, like, they take science, but there's also a lot of political reasons. So I think, yeah, legalizing cannabis, it's definitely not just a scientific issue. There's lots of other reasons why it was legalized, and I can't really speak to the political side of things.
Okay, that's fair enough. I'm sure that money is probably a motivating factor there too. You won't make as much money if you are only selling for medicinal purposes. But
can I just add though, one of the things I always think of, especially when it's, I don't know, people my generation and older that are talking about like cannabis, and I always think, well, if your experience of cannabis when you were at university and you were smoking these like low potency products, you might not actually realize what's out on the street now and some of the real high potency products. So I think they don't always know the true story of what goes on.
yeah, fair enough, fair enough. So we did have a sort of semi off-topic question, but Charlie wanted to know what the difference between forensic science, forensic biology, and forensic chemistry is. And I'm just going to field that very quickly by saying that forensic science is really just an umbrella term that we give to any kind of science that we can apply to the law or to the legal system, right? So we have toxicology. As soon as toxicology becomes legal, or in a sort of case of law, then it's forensic toxicology. So same thing with chemistry and biology. You look at human tissues or human fluids or human DNA, that's biology. But as soon as it becomes a matter of criminal investigation or for legal purposes, that's when it's forensic biology. So the difference between forensic bio and forensic chem, bio is mainly human tissues and DNA and genomic sequencing and that kind of stuff. So, you know, matching or finding consistencies between blood that you find at a crime scene with the blood of your victim or the blood of the suspect. That's forensic biology. Whereas forensic chemistry is mostly unknown substance tracing, elemental analysis, ballistics and gunshot residue, really trying to discover or find unknown substances. And I think Dr. Woodall, if you want to expand on that, just if I forgot anything out of those definitions.
No, I think that that was a good summary of them. Yeah, so as it's forensic just means like for purposes of the law. And so biology is, as you mentioned, it kind of focuses more on like the DNA, like the blood analysis. Chemistry tends to be the analytical side of things. Toxicology can, sometimes I see it as a mixture, but like there's a bit of chemistry because you have to analyze for the drugs, but there's some biology involved in like the effects of drugs on the body. So yeah, there's some differences, but you get a chance if you at UTM, you get a chance to do kind of introduction courses, and sometimes people do change what they want their specialty to be once they join UTM.
Cool, thank you. Tara, this is actually a question that I'm going to throw to you. I don't know if you'll know, but do you actually know how many students are admitted into first year forensic science?
Yes, I can speak to that. I have a rough number, so I don't have an exact number, but first at UTM in general, we have approximately 15,000 undergraduate students studying. So each year for an incoming first year, we're looking at a few thousand students. So roughly between 3,000 to 3,500 students, that would be for incoming first year for all our programs. Forensic science specifically, that admission category, we're looking at a few hundred students.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so you can see how we're a pretty competitive program. We don't get a giant pool of applicants. So it's not like psychology where you might get, 1,000 first year students split into several courses or classes in first year. But we are competitive. So keep those grades up. Don't think you're going to get it just because we don't have a large entry pool. All right, back to Dr. Woodall. How effective is marijuana as a painkiller? Also, why are painkillers like fentanyl still prescribed if they're so highly addictive and people can easily overdose on them?
It's the thing about fentanyl and the painkillers, the problem is that some people that live with chronic pain conditions, they can't really function and they can't have a normal life unless they get some treatment for their pain conditions. So it's getting the balance right because obviously now this opioid crisis has kind of happened and you're getting all these deaths. But it started, people didn't realize this was going to happen. And then even now where they try and change some of the laws and tighten up the requirements for the opioid prescriptions, you get some of the pain specialists that say, but like our patients, they can't survive without access to pain medications. So it's trying to find that balance between helping the people in need, but trying to cut down the kind of the illicit use of things. And to be honest, right now, it started off, it was the prescription medications that got diverted. But now, even if you stopped all those prescription medications and they weren't available, there's the illicit drug trade and the drug people that make it themselves. So I don't think you would stop it, even just stopping the prescription stuff. Going back to the question about cannabis, I think cannabis under certain conditions can help painful conditions, but there's still a lot of research to be done on the science of that. So I think that it can be useful for some pain conditions, but I don't think it's ever going to replace some of the other more specific pain killers like opioids that are going to be better at targeting kind of more acute pain.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm going to quickly just answer some of the program related questions. Janessa, you asked, do students in the forensics program have to study criminology, law, or politics? The answer is no, except there is one third-year required course called Forensic Science and the Law in Canada. This is really important because if you're continuing through as a forensic scientist, you probably want to know what legal systems are in there so you can be an effective expert witness once you're all brilliant and working in the field. So it is good to take a few law courses. It's not a bad idea. It's not required, but there will be one specific law course that is required to cover. Kanjana wanted to know, is forensic toxicology a topic that is taught under forensic science, and is it taught in first year? No, we're actually thinking about making it a specialist degree, but that's a couple of years in the making. Right now, forensic toxicology is kind of its own neat entity in the forensic science program, and the tox courses that Dr. Woodall teaches are, I think they're electives, right? You can take them in conjunction to complete your degree requirements.
Yeah.
Some of them is the science of cannabis, forensic toxicology, and also forensic psychopharmacology, which is the sort of synthesis between drugs that people take and the behavior and the way it changes the brain. So there are certainly a lot of really cool tox courses that you can be taking in your undergraduate degree. We just do not have a specialist for it just yet. And another question for Dr. Woodall. Janessa asked, what kind of developments are happening in the toxicology field? She apologizes just because she missed a portion due to an overlapping session. So I guess we talked about cannabis and the opioid crisis, but are there any sort of really cool developments?
In the field of forensic toxicology, there's so many new kind of analytical methods and equipment available now. So the number of drugs and the ability to detect low concentrations of drugs improves all the time. Forensic toxicology is kind of an interesting field right now. Like I mentioned the cannabis and the opioid crisis, but the number of drugs that are available now kind of illegally over the internet has exploded. So people are taking all sorts of drugs. There's the sale of drugs across different countries that didn't happen. So it's a really rapidly expanding field, and it's pretty interesting because you need to keep up with what drugs you're detecting, how you detect them, and then also what are these drugs, what effects do they have on the body. So yeah, definitely interesting times in the field of forensic toxicology.
I guess in that note, what is the job market like for forensic toxicology?
I'd say right now it's pretty good. At the Center for Forensic Sciences, for example, forensic toxicology in recent years has been hiring a lot, like maybe even more than all the other sections. And I know within Canada, the RCMP, they're trying to hire forensic toxicologists all the time. They're trying to expand their laboratories. So right now, like just within Canada, there's a lot more jobs than there were like 10, 20 years ago.
Awesome. Thank you very much. we don't have any more specific questions in the chat. We have about 6 minutes, so this session will stop right at 7 o'clock. So if you have any more burning questions, you have about 6 more minutes. You did get some thank you so much to Dr. Woodall for this amazing lecture. Oh, we have forensic toxicology versus forensic chemistry. What's the difference?
Forensic chemistry, well, there's a little bit of an overlap. So forensic toxicology has some chemistry involved because the actual analytical side of things, that's analytical chemistry. So how do you detect these drugs? What methods? But then for me, I was never that great at chemistry, to be honest, when I was younger. So I actually like the side of things, which is the like the interpretation of the drugs, the effects of drugs on the body. So that's also a big part of forensic toxicology. And you get forensic toxicologists that are good at the chemistry side, some that, like me, that are more kind of like biology oriented. Forensic chemistry does a lot of, as I said, like the analytical chemistry, and forensic chemistry do other types of analysis. So for example, like gunshot residues, like paint analysis, that kind of thing. So there's definitely an overlap, but yeah, slightly different. And if you came to UTM, there's a forensic chemistry major, but there's also other courses you can take, so you don't have to end up going into forensic chemistry. There's definitely an overlap.
Yeah, we try to make it as open as possible for students, you know, so that you can change, you know, if you not feeling chemistry in your second year or whatever the case may be, maybe you want to flip towards biology or anthropology and see what works for you. We do have a question that maybe Tara can help me with. Can you enroll in forensic science as a major and then take 2 minors? Is that something that's possible, 2 minors?
Yes, so technically it is something that's possible, but it's not a very common combination that students do. So in order to graduate, you need 20 credits, which typically it equates to about 5 credits each year. So a total of 4 years in order to earn your degree. The majority of students do a specialist and a minor, or 2 majors and a minor, or a major and a minor. But if you want to do 2 minors, I'm sure you can. You just might have to take spend a little extra time. So maybe take an extra course in summer school here or there.
I think I would agree with that, because I mean, forensic science as a program is pretty intense as it is. And if you're in the general major, you're going to be doing a double degree anyway. So now you're going to be doing 2 major degrees and 2 minor degrees. That's a lot of prerequisites to get through. Totally doable, but you will have to expect that maybe you need a 5th year or even a 6th year to complete all those prerequisites.
And it can really vary too on the type of minor, and then taking into consideration when those courses are offered too. If it's from a different section or a different admission department, at UTM, working out the courses within doing all of that at once, it might take a little bit longer to do.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And Michael in the chat actually has just said the 3 most popular combinations are 1 specialist or 2 majors, or 1 major and 2 minors. Yeah, so those are basically the things that people do the most. Either you take a major, or sorry, either you take a specialist, or you take 2 majors, or you take a major and 2 minors. It is pretty great though that U of T offers so many possibilities for those combinations. I know, so when I did my undergrad at McMaster University, not that anything's wrong with McMaster University, but pretty much to my memory, you could do a major and a minor, and that was kind of pretty much it. But UTM really offers a lot of options for combining your degrees. Any last questions? We have 2 more minutes. Is taking the double degree better than the specialist program? That's a great question. No, because they both are focused on 2 different career paths. So the double degree is typically for people who are interested in police foundations or police work, investigations, crime scenes, first responding, being at the crime scene. The specialist degree is really more for people who enjoy working in the lab setting, analyzing evidence, and doing that sort of more analytical side of forensic science. So not one's better or worse, they're just 2 different trajectories. So you should know really where you want to end up in a career because it's going to help guide you there. All right, and with our last minute, I'm going to say thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Woodall. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Esme, for being there in the shadows as well. I hope you guys found this really informative. Any last words from any of our panelists?
Just say thanks everybody for watching the lecture tonight.
Yeah, I second that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. We will have more stuff on Saturday. So we have a mock lecture from Dr. Navrosky, our forensic biologist, on Saturday, as well as another student panel, as well as another program fair where I will be in the chats. So everybody have a great week and we hope to see you next year. Bye-bye.